Sequels, DLC, and follow-ups are very hit or miss in general, and the interactivity of video games only enhances that disparity. A great sequel can revive the spirit of an old game, but as a result, it can also retroactively ruin something. An unsolved mystery can have an unsatisfying answer. An improvement can highlight a flaw, and a new problem can ruin an old catharsis. What makes for a good sequel and what makes for a bad one? Which games do the best job of following up a good act? And how can a good sequel manage to be a good game on top of that? The most common type of follow-up is one that fleshes out what's already there or escalates on top of it. The simplest example is the Arkham series, where each game's scope is drastically wider. You go from exploring a couple of buildings to a large prison to an evacuated city, and the game's mechanics reflect that. You start with a point A to B jump, graduate to an A to B to C vaulting glide, and climax with a sexy, powerful slingshot above and beyond your grapnel target. The problem with this genre of sequel is that it hurts the old game to be so blatantly one-upped. If you play the games in reverse order, then you can't help but feel handicapped when you're really not. One example of a follow-up avoiding this problem is the Farewell DLC from Celeste, where the game takes advantage of its engine and forces you to abuse bugs to make it through the game. This secret tech still works in early chapters though, so it actually teaches you to outsmart the early game puzzles. I don't imagine this would work out well for a sequel proper outside of something like Mario's Lost Levels, which is basically just a harder version of the same game, but when it does, it's extremely satisfying. One example of what you don't want in a follow-up and why the escalation approach is so common is because you don't want to be too samey. You'd think that if the original were good, then just more would automatically be better, but that isn't always the case. Take Smash Ultimate, a completely serviceable Smash game, but since it's so similar to Smash 4, much more than Melee was to Brawl or Brawl was to 4, a lot of people felt it aged faster since it gave them a sense of deja vu. Another example could be the black sheep of the Arkham series from before, Arkham Origins. This game is very similar to its predecessor Arkham City with the same movement and half of the map recycled. Now, this game has its own problems, but since players who came off the prior entry already know the mechanics, the tutorial drags, and the difficulty is constantly lacking. Compare that to Arkham Knight, which spoils you for new tools early on, with a multi-takedown, ranged options, and a whole-ass tank. One thing I don't want you to take away from this video is that different is bad. Just because something is following something up doesn't mean that it has to be the same or even similar at all. For instance, there's the Shovel Knight DLCs, which all completely change the way you play the game. Shovel Knight is all about the vertical stab, Plague Knight is more projectile based, Spectre Knight attacks diagonally, and King Knight has a horizontal charge. They all approach the world very differently, so it feels like a whole new game each time around. For an even stronger example, look to Metal Gear Revengeance, which took the cyborg ninja character archetype that the series always had around and built a whole game around it. MGS is all about outsmarting more powerful opponents by avoiding their sightlines and manipulating their behavior, but MGR is a fast-paced, reflex-heavy power trip. The secret to MGR's success is that, as different as it is, it's not antithetical to the themes of its progenitor. It's still a story of elaborate conspiracy with campy boss fights and front-loaded moralizing. It just so happens to also be an action game. To contrast, there's Resident Evil 4, which, while being one of the greatest games of all time, is considered a kind of unfortunate sequel. Even though the first 3 games in the franchise were always pretty popcorn, they were still all about horror and creeping out the player. RE4 starts off that way with some Lovecraftian themes, but it ends up subverting the genre and turning the whole thing into a joke. It's a good joke, but it's ultimately antithetical to its origins, and it caused a rift in the follow-ups going forwards. You can, however, subvert what the player expects from a follow-up without throwing shade on the original. MGS2 largely starts out as an escalation sequel, playing very similarly to MGS1 with some extra polish, but then it flips to parody the original and the idea of sequels in general. By the time you get to the ending, you're not even sure if the game actually happened or if it was all just a VR recreation. Keep in mind, this is a risk on top of a risk, though. When MGS2 came out, it was pretty controversial, and even now people are torn on it. Another important factor to be aware of is that each individual piece of art needs to stand on its own. Whether you want them to or not, people are going to jump into your series whenever's most immediate to them, and that means they'll likely miss out on your references. What's worse is that every game has to endure the worst case scenarios of both legacy and independence. If your game can't stand out on its own, then you lose a portion of your audience, but if your game doesn't compete with its predecessors, then you lose a different chunk. Luigi's Mansion is charming and fun on its own, but since it followed up Mario 64, there were a lot of people who felt disappointed by it just by virtue of it not being a 3D platformer. That wouldn't have happened if you weren't playing as Mario's bro, but since it shares the same universe, it has a legacy to live up to. To sum it up, there are a lot of ways to successfully follow something up, so long as you know that your piece's quality is directly competing with the old hotness. One-upping yourself is extremely satisfying when it works, even if it highlights the shortcomings of the original. More of a good thing isn't bad, but it does put extra tension on a game's flaws when players feel like they've already been here before. And being different isn't bad so long as the spin-off isn't antithetical and respects the spirit of its progenitor. It's a high-risk gambit. Play your cards wrong, and you ruin 2 games. But if you play them right, your franchise can become greater than the sum of its parts.